Hello, everyone. Welcome to the session today. Thank you for joining in. I'm Saurabh Sen, Chief Mentor and Founder at Catalyst Learning Services, welcoming all of you to the Catalyst Knowledge Transfer Series that we have been conducting every month since the time we locked down in 2020. Catalyst, since 2011, has been focused on training, mentoring, and grooming students, young professionals, working professionals, graduates to pursue careers in the development sector. Over the last 10 years, we have been supporting our student community extensively with career awareness, support for entrance tests, interviews, mentoring for the master's as well as bachelor's programs offered by social science institutes in India as well as abroad. Since the time we locked down last year with the COVID-19 pandemic, every week at Catalyst, we have tried to connect with our largest community in the country, in our students, in our aspirants, to hold together the level of knowledge required to understand the society better and chart careers that is necessary to fill in the demands of the market, the society, as well as the needs of the people. I'm very happy to share the information that till date, we have been able to conduct 45 such webinars over a span of the last 2 years. And on this 46th webinar today, the Catalyst Knowledge Transfer Series, I'm very pleased to welcome Lavanya Shanbhogue Arvind as the speaker for the day. Lavanya Shanbhogue Arvind is an academic, novelist, feminist research scholar, and a TEDx speaker. She currently teaches gender and forms of social vulnerability at the Center of Disasters and Development, Jamsetji Tata School of Disaster Studies, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. Her research interests are in the area of gender and development, gender in disaster settings, gender and sexuality, social exclusion, and disasters. Lavanya has a postgraduate degree in women's studies, also a postgraduate degree in business studies, as well as fine arts. She has also completed an MPhil in women's studies and is currently pursuing her PhD in women's studies from the Advanced Center of Women's Studies, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. She was awarded the Best Student Prize 2015-16 and the Institute Gold Medal 2015-17 for academic performance in MA in Women's Studies by TISS. Lavanya has published academic papers in reputed journals and presented papers in both national and international conferences. Most recently, she has published a paper on gender in disaster settings in the United Nations Encyclopedia for Sustainable Development Goals. Additionally, Lavanya is the winner of the Commonwealth Short Story Special Prize 2011. Her writings have been published in both Indian and international presses. Her nonfiction writings on feminist themes have appeared in Huffington Post, Hindu Business Line, Madras Courier, Bloomberg Quint, amongst others. She has awarded the Dr. Avabhai Wadia and Dr. Khurshedji Wadia Fellowship for archival research by Research Center for Women's Studies, SNDT Women's University, Mumbai. She has also been awarded the Writers in Immersion and Cultural Exchange, WRICE Fellowship by RMIT University, Australia. Lavanya has been invited as speakers at numerous symposiums and conferences, both academic and creative. She has been also invited as speakers to Kolkata Literature Festival 2017, WIC Dehradun Community Literature Festival 2017, Kala Ghoda Literature Festival 2018, Le Sutra Bandra Poetry and Literature Festival 2018, Kala Ghoda Literature Festival, the Jakarta Post Writers Series, and the Melbourne Writers Festival in 2018. Lavanya's debut novel, The Heavens We Chase, set in pre-partition British India, was released by Rowley Books in 2016 and received critical acclaim. She co-edits the US-based print magazine, Speak the Magazine, that is available in over 265 barns and noble stores across the states. And last but not the least, Lavanya still, out of all of these as her work, manages time to be with us and share her story and also resolve your questions and doubts. Lavanya, thank you so much. I and all of us at Catalyst, we are, I would rather use the word excited to know more about you. In the sense that the span of time you've spent and the type of, I would say, area that you've covered with your interest is pretty astounding. One word which stood out for me, Lavanya, throughout has been literature for you. So I would like to, pass on the session to you and request all the participants to be as interactive with Lavanya as possible. Lavanya, if you can just help us understand to start off with maybe that the knowledge of literature and your writing skills and your exposure, how closely has that been correlated to, say, social science, disaster management, and the type of specialization that you focus upon?
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Saurabheshwar. Thank you to Catalyst. Thank you for all of you for being here today and that introduction. So thanks so much. To answer your question, I've always been sort of drawn to the arts, to the poetry, to literature, to cultural studies, and because I believe the human experience is quite irreducible, and there are multiple ways of looking at that experience, and you could academicize it, intellectualize it, and look at it through the various disciplinary lenses that we use right now. Or you could turn it into art. And somehow I want to do both. And if there's a space to do that, I try to kind of navigate both worlds in that sense. So I want to write about people and what they go through and the humanness of their experience, and also look at disaster management through the lens of humanism, and to see how we can look at human suffering such, and how do we reduce human suffering. So art also does that. We turn to art when life becomes unbearable. So think about all the times you wonder why you offer a movie. So and the music we listen to or a painting we admire, it's just to escape from the harshness of reality sometimes. And discipline like the social sciences within that, particularly disaster management, it's also about how do you alleviate human pain. I want to begin by saying disaster studies is emerging globally as a full-fledged academic discipline. And as a field of practice, it demands specialization to meet dynamic challenges posed by disasters. And we must be deeply respectful of the fact that the discipline of disaster studies and management and the underlying knowledge production are essentially learnings. That knowledge is coming from the learnings of monumental suffering of people. It's coming from the learnings from mortality, from devastating losses, and what I call the irreducible nature of the human experience. So people are in pain, and from that pain we are building the foundation of this knowledge. And how do you reduce that pain? So all the buzzwords, disaster management or disaster risk reduction or capacity building or vulnerability reduction, all of this, if you were to just look at it, we're trying to reduce loss, suffering, and pain. And this is something you can look at it from an artistic lens as well. What I'm going to do today is I want to talk about the gendering the discipline. How do you look at it from a gender perspective? My training is in gender, and my training is in gender because my interest is in gender and my passion is in gender, and so you kind of navigate to that space. And so I'm going to look at the discipline from a gender perspective, and I'm also going to talk about careers, because you're young students and you want to know what's in it for me, right? So, let's look at it from a practical lens as well. So what kind of jobs will you get post the course, especially if you want to work in the gender space? So I'll try to keep the focus to that. I have a PowerPoint. So on that note, I will share my a brief PowerPoint. I won't take too much of your time. I want to, as you said, I want to make this interactive so that we can have more time for questions rather than me rambling on for a long time. I want to begin by saying we are talking about gender responsive disaster risk reduction. Sorry, the word should be responsive and not response. Gender responsive disaster risk reduction. We've moved beyond gender sensitive. We say gender sensitive, but it's good to be sensitive, but we want to be more than sensitive. We want to actually do something. We want to respond to disasters and reduce the risk, especially for the most marginalized and vulnerable groups. And I'll show you evidence why it's a gendered sort of question. So what I want to do is, this is for people who are entirely new to the discipline. We're talking about, in disaster studies, we say that there is a hazard, which is something that can cause harm, right? But who does it cause harm to? It causes harm to those who are most exposed to it. So who is most exposed to the harm? So the exposure is the condition of being unprotected from that hazard. So who is the most exposed to that hazard? The second is vulnerability. So vulnerability are basically characteristics or circumstances of a person or a group that influence their capacity to anticipate, to resist, to cope, and to recover from the impact of a hazard. Okay? So these are just basic concepts that we must know in the field. And we are saying that there is a pre-existing foundation of gender inequality and gender inequities. So genders in the plural, it's not men and women, but it's across the gender spectrum, face a lot of obstacles and impediment to resources, to information that do not allow them to respond and cope with the disaster. But having said that, I don't want to paint women, gender minorities, and girl children and the identities only as victims, because we must recognize the endogenous sort of capacities of women. They have social networks, there's indigenous knowledge, there is traditional architecture, there is, you have your own ways and means of preserving your culture, which has taught you how to cope with adversity. So we have to locate it within the existing. So it's not, and victimhood is not a permanent state. You're not going to be a victim forever. So you might have been a victim of one disaster event, but how do you, and it might have, you might recover like slower than other identities, but you have your own capacity. So how can we identify what is it that you can already do very well and then build on that? So that's what I'm trying to do. I mean, that's the pitch. So it's not about painting, this bleak, woeful tale of, they are victims. So we say that disasters, there's a myth that disasters are great equalizers, that no one can be spared from the fury of an earthquake or a storm or a pandemic, but we are all in the same boat. But that's not necessarily true. I mean, the boat, for somebody it's a yacht and somebody it's a raft. So we're not in the same boat, right? So the understanding of existing social vulnerabilities is critical to disaster management. So what I've done is I've tried to gender the vulnerability context, and we're saying that vulnerabilities are not
I think is
dimension.
Lavanya audible? Yeah, I think possibly we did not have an audio for just, I think, 15 seconds.
Okay.
No problem.
Right. So I think I'm audible now, right?
Yes.
So the vulnerabilities, as I said, are multidimensional. So somebody is economically vulnerable because if you look at the labor force participation today, India has one of the lowest female workforce participation rate in the world, one of the lowest. So only 23% of the labor force today is women. And there's a downward decreasing trend, and the pandemic has pushed women out of the workforce. And there are cultural expectations of women as homemakers. There's this sort of saying that says we expect women to work as though they don't have children and raise children as though they don't work. So there's the whole cultural expectation of women. There are burdens of care work in the household, which is unpaid. And most of the concentration of the labor force is in the informal sector, which is unregulated, characterized by lack of any labor protectionism or very little labor protectionism and social security. And there's an extreme intra-household inequality, right? So this is what is the existing economic dimension. Now, when we look at the socio-cultural dimension, I'm using the WHO life cycle typology. What this basically means is that it's not a homogeneous group. Women, girl children, they're not a homogeneous group. They are the problems or the differential vulnerabilities vary across age. So from infancy all the way to the elderly women, there are various problems, socio-cultural in nature, that they face. So say from infancy, you're looking at female feticide, and we see that in the decline of sex ratios, 0 to 6 years. We don't have the latest census. The last census we have is 2011. There are census done in pockets, but I mean, not census, but surveys done in pockets around the country, and the sex ratios are not improving. This is despite campaigns such as the Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao and all that, right? So we have a problem. And then in the girlhood, there is increases in child marriages and pandemic. I'll show you some statistics from the pandemic that a lot of girls were pushed into child marriages for the simple reason being that COVID brought about a restriction on the number of guests. So, right, that means you don't have to pay for a big wedding. So parents felt that it's easy to get the daughters married because I don't have to pay for a big wedding. So there was this big spate of increases in child marriages in the COVID era. And it continues to happen. So 20 years of work done by grassroots level women development workers was eroded in a matter of 18 to 19 months, but just in the child marriage. So across the life cycle of girls and women, and there are a range of oppressions and discriminations which are social cultural in nature. I don't want to go into it. You know some of these things already in terms of when I talk about sexual harassment or trafficking or domestic violence and so on. And so it's across the life cycle. So we cannot look at it as a homogeneous group. So when we say I want to integrate the gender question, we cannot look at it as a unidimensional thing. We have to look at it across the spectrum of age. And so this is a small sort of diagram I've tried to represent the ecological crisis. We talk about climate change, we talk about sustainability, we talk about extreme weather events being on the rise. So how does it affect, how is it gendered? So gendering the ecological sort of crisis. Okay, so let's look at it like a cycle. So we have an exceptionally extractive relationship with the environment. So you have unsustainable uses of natural resources, greenhouse gases, poor land management. It's a very extracted relationship. This causes climate change in various ways, the anthropogenic activity on the environment, so rising sea levels, rainfall, agrarian crisis, flash floods, urban floods, and so on. You know what's happening. Now, this has general impacts, which is it undermines poor livelihoods, food securities, causes distress migration, displacement to urban informal settlements, and there are mortality and losses. But these are the general impacts, but we have to gender it. So when we gender the general impacts, what happens is that who are the most vulnerable? Women are, the FAO calls women the hungriest of the hungry. And various developmental organizations call women the poorest of the poor. So the female-headed households are one of the poorest in the country because of the gender gap or wage gap, and also the fact that they're concentrated in the informal sector. So you're outside the formal economy, and there is an erosion of subsistence livelihoods, subsistence-based livelihoods. The agrarian sector is in distress, and you have the dual burdens of the family and the market, and there are other social and political and cultural barriers and very weak institutional arrangements because you have no access to credit. Today you and I can go to a bank, show our Aadhaar, and show our, our salary statements if we're salaried, and get loans. But even then, you will be asked for a collateral. What will poor, illiterate women or transgenders do without this ability to give you a collateral to access credit or to access the market? So, and the gender needs are subsumed under household needs. So if there is a ration being distributed to a household, the family, she will feed the family, she'll feed her children, and then she might not eat, so the hungriest of the hungry. So the ecological crisis directly affects healthcare, food security, livelihoods, and it is exceptionally and extremely gendered, and we have to look at it not as a unidimensional way, but across the life cycle of how does it affect young girl children? How does it affect a 14-year-old? How does it affect a 25-year-old? How does it affect a 50-year-old? We have to look at it like that. It's not a homogeneous group. And we have various evidences coming in that says that it's creating the category of the environmental refugee or the climate refugee, of which anywhere between 40 to 60%, as the data is emerging, they are women and girl children and women. And various Interpol, UNEP, various organizations are publishing reports on the climate refugee. You are rendered landless because of climate change, and you're vulnerable to displacement, and you're vulnerable in displacement. Okay, because what displacement does is it erodes your adaptive capacities that are linked to location. I know this area, I know there's a forest here, I know there's a water body here, and I know there's a market here. Now I take you out of that place and I put you somewhere far away. I don't know anything. And so you're actually eroding whatever capacities they already have. So this is happening currently. And we're talking about, as I said, livelihood, health, and food security. So we're talking about health inequalities and, of course, the caste angle in our country. It is a deeply casteist society, and we cannot ignore it. And this is from the NFHS 4, that is National Family Health Survey 4, we see that who is accessing healthcare when they are sick, what percentage, and what is the life expectancy of different castes. And we know the life expectancy for lower caste women are much lower than the higher caste because of access to healthcare and political participation. If you do not bring women into decision-making fold, do not bring transgender identities into the decision-making fold, to to kind of put pressure on policy, to bring about changes in the policy. Without representative voices, we are really struggling. So can 70 or 80% of men in the parliament represent the other identities and make transformatory decisions? It's a question. So the 2014 elections, we have about 11 to 12% in the 11.9 to 12% of women in the parliament. 2019, it's 14% women in the parliament. This is the question I asked in the admissions interview. I asked, what is the percentage of women in the Lok Sabha? And no one is able to answer. I say, just tell me a percentage, give me a range. How many women are there in the parliament, the Lok Sabha, and how many women? So anyway, that's secondary. So this is the political, economic, social. So we spoke about the pre-existing vulnerabilities. Now, what happens? Okay, we are on a foundation of these vulnerabilities, but what happens in disaster settings? In disaster settings, for example, in the 2004 tsunami and any flooding situation, women are simply swept away because they don't know how to swim. Survival skills such as swimming are not taught to them because of patriarchal impositions of modesty and then the dress codes and things like that. You're not able to swim, and you don't climb trees because we've been told girls don't climb trees. That kind of your instinctive in fight or flight mode. You're not able to leave, right? And this is our own studies, relief. Who is able to access relief, questions of reproductive health care, because healthcare is very unidimensional. It'll look at waterborne diseases, it'll look at fever, it'll look at malaria. But what about reproductive health care in post-disaster situations? Because in a flooding event, it is entirely about reproductive health care because of the way our bodies are. Flood water is seeped into your body. You're going to battle infection, and you need reproductive health care. I do need a frozen. So, so that kind of questioning of healthcare. And I've already covered this. There is a large scale trafficking, and post-disaster events are a hotbed for trafficking, because especially of young girls who are isolated from their families or who've lost their families. And before NGOs and any other kind of governmental intervention can come to bring them together, there is a problem. We spoke about the tsunami, restrictive clothing, lack of toilets, the relief camps being exceptionally unidimensional in their approach to relief. Sometimes relief is routed through the Khap Panchayat. So it's when you route relief through a Khap Panchayat, we talk about in disaster management, we talk about last mile coverage. So what happens when institutions along the way will not ensure last mile coverage because they are hierarchical in a certain manner. Again, in earthquakes, there are the higher mortality for women because they are indoors. They are indoors cooking and cleaning and taking care of children. So that and early warning, this is true even today, although this is an example from the Bangladesh cyclone. Early warning information was transmitted by men to men in public places. Okay. Today also, if you look at the digital divide, a household will have one phone, and who will access that phone? So they don't get early warning information. And this is true if you look at there was a study done in 2017 by the number of internet users. Only 30% of the internet users are women in the country, despite the very high internet penetration. So, and there are lots of things. Girls who, if you give mobile phone, they'll be talking to their boyfriends, and that kind of stories get peddled by those questions. So in slow onset disasters such as droughts, the household water management is something that women are expected to do, and you have to fetch water. So it takes up a lot of their time. Compensations are given in for men. Title deeds are not in women's names. I already spoke about sexual assaults, and if you look at the typology, life cycle typology, but I also want to talk about the gender. When we talk about gender, we can't restrict ourselves only to women, girls, children, gender minorities. It's a differential vulnerability of different genders. So if you look at men, many believe that they are the stronger sex, or they're stronger, and therefore there's no psychosocial care given to men at all. So counseling services are all rooted to women. Yeah, so mental health, men's mental health goes completely out of, and men have a higher suicide rate in the country. So these sort of problems persist, and also many men are exposed to risky situations, saying that you have to go and do some heroism and do some rescue, but you're not trained to do that, right? So there are multiple ways of looking at it. And in the pandemic, there was, and while child marriages were a menace for the girl children, child labor was a menace for boy children. So they sent a lot of young boys to go into child labor. So so it is a sort of problem. And so these are some of the, we already spoke about violence, we spoke about water contamination and problems in the refugee camp, and what sort of problems displacement creates a new class of dependence. And this is the COVID pandemic. There was a rise in domestic violence, and this is not only in India, it is across the world, even in the so-called developed world. You've seen, I don't want to take much time here, but the statistics are there and you can go and see it. There has been an increase in domestic violence and demands for emergency sort of shelter. These are the unintended consequences, because you're locked in with the abuser, with your abuser. And this is the number of people who were subject to intimate partner violence and sexual or physical violence during the pandemic globally. And you're cut out or cut off from critical services, and they were not treated as essential. Because in the pandemic, we saw that certain services were treated as essential services and certain services are not essential at all. So any kind of support for domestic violence was not treated as essential at all. And we have all kinds of problems because of this, and which we're still battling. Yeah. There's the first reasons for increase in domestic violence during the pandemic. One was you're cut off from your natal family. The first person a girl calls when she's in trouble is her parents, and you're cut off from them. You can't travel, and the formal support system is gone through because it's not considered essential. Right. So under the Domestic Violence Act of 2005, every police station must have a protection officer, a woman who will help a woman in distress. But all of the police machinery were channelized towards COVID protocol management. So there was no one to do the work of the protection officer. So these sort of problems persist. And this is the child marriage. As I said, 10 million additional child marriages took place during the COVID outbreak. These are some statistics. There was an increase between 15 to 25%. Reports are still emerging. And one of the primary reasons for increase in child marriage was that marriage expense would be much lower, because only 50 people were allowed, or 25. It kept changing along the way, but marriage expenses would be lower. Although the dowry would not change, the expenditure on feeding and all that. So school dropouts, we know this. I don't want to take too much of your time because I want to keep some time for discussions and questions. But school dropouts, we don't know how many girls will go back to school when schools reopen. The dropouts are expected to be higher for girl children. And also, there will be a dropout in male children as well, school dropouts, because they've been forced into child labor to sort of sustain family incomes and supplement family incomes. And yeah, so it's you have to look at it from both sides. So gender roles, you can see the gender roles quite clearly here. The boy has to go and work and the girl has to get married. So it's just that getting amplified in the worst possible sort of ways. Again, this is the child brides going up. 25 years of progress on child marriages were fueled by school closures and economic destitution. So we have, it's not a good situation. Yeah, so we are quite, there has been an erosion of all the great work that has been done by grassroots levels. Save the Children critics that 10 million children might never return to school because of the pandemic. This is both boys and girls. So I'm just wrapping up in the next 5 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes actually. And I just want to say that, so what does it mean for, how do you become, bring in gender into DRR? One is you understand that there's a foundation of a pre-existing social condition. So understand that there's gender inequality, and how do you integrate it into the questions of DRR, which is your disaster risk reduction, vulnerability reduction, enhancing coping capacities. It cannot be unidimensional. You have to have targeted interventions across the spectrum. Look at unequal access to resources and information. I gave you the example of early warning signal systems, and account for social roles. So these are things that we have to continuously keep doing. It's not a one-time thing. And we speak about resilience a lot. Resilience has become a buzzword. We want people to become more resilient and so on. So resilience, we are saying, is the ability of a system to recover, to resist, absorb, accommodate, and recover fast. How can you absorb a shock, and how fast can you recover? How much can you bounce back? It's tough, because the vulnerabilities are different. So resilient ability to bounce back will be different. So when we have, it's directly linked to your capacities. So there are 3 kinds of capacities, if I may add this. This is one way to look at it. Of course, resilience has been studied from various lenses. One way to look at it is, what is your existing capacity? How quickly can you handle a shock, stress, and uncertainty? How can you, over a period of time, adjust to change and potential damage? And how can you reconfigure and move towards a newer and more sustainable long-term state? These are 3 capacities, and you build the capacities for all the genders, looking at their existing vulnerability, looking at their social, economic, cultural, ecological exclusion, their political exclusion, discriminations, marginalization across the life cycle. And then that's how you build resilience. You can't build resilience of a community without looking at the different, the heterogeneity of the community, without looking at the differences within the community. So we have to move towards a gender responsive disaster risk reduction, and ignoring the gender dimension is a risk. It creates new risks, and we have to include gender in development work in disasters, and include disaster work in gender and development work. So when you're working on food security, when you're working on livelihoods, when you're working on health, it has to integrate the disaster and climate change question. It cannot be one department is working on food security and one is looking at DRR. You have to integrate the two. Look at needs, opportunities, roles informed by culture, and insurance programs specific to women, social protection specific to enhance long-term livelihood. And the last point is what I want to finish at. We talk about states. We know migration is a thing, right? Migration will happen. So how can there be state-sponsored migration pathways? It's a question. We don't know yet how it's going to look like. And how do you make it safer for people to migrate? I just want to look at the career options. I'll put this out here and then we can take questions. So what I've done in terms of careers is I've broken it. If you want to work in this sector, if you want to work in gendering the DM space, one is you can work at an intervention level where the beneficiaries are gendered. You can look at grassroots level organizations, NGOs, public administration, states, civil society organization. You can work on with developmental organizations like UNDP and so on. Or you can work in a research-based space, teaching, training, consultancy, policy, research. Or you can work in the technological space. Because, you know, we are trying repeatedly, we're talking about machine learning and artificial intelligence, all of this. How do you predict better? And then how does that prediction become inclusive in terms of the dissemination of information? So on that note, I will end my session today, and we will take questions and thank you so much.
Right. Thank you so much, Lavanya. I think that was a very, I would say, intriguing dissemination of experience, thoughts, and knowledge. I open the session to questions to any and many of you. If you want, you're most welcome to turn on your microphone and ask a question if you deem fit. So till people ask questions, I think they are just settling in. I would like to maybe ask a question from my end, Lavanya.
Yes, please.
On behalf of all the participants also, is that looking ahead, one is that the entire disaster risk reduction space that you spoke of, from the different dimensions under, say, even a gender lens, we saw a lot of dimensions. We saw you can intervene with the help of technology, you can intervene with the help of the natural space. There is a big scope of sensitization, which we have been definitely looking at. Lavanya, if you would like to share this with everyone, that when it comes to working in the space of disaster risk reduction, what do you think could be the essential, you may call it skills or competency, in an aspirant which you feel would be important to work in that space? Because a lot of times students have the popular question on their minds that, okay, is it for me? I mean, like, you know, or what do I need to do or learn or acquire to be part of that space? So is there any foundational skill that you would like to highlight on that note for everyone? Thank you.
Right. Thanks so much. About skills. One is, as I said, the discipline is still emerging. We are about post the tsunami in 2004 is when the discipline sort of evolved in India, at least. So we set up ministries and we passed the Disaster Management Act and so on. So one is to understand the different, you have to be an analyst, you know. I would say an analyst is someone who's able to look at nuance, who is able to look at complexity and not be afraid of complexity, because it's very complex, disrupted, and you're working in a disrupted environment. You're not working in a regular environment at all. You're working in an emergency environment. You're working in a disrupted environment, and you cannot be afraid of complexity. And right. So what we do, the concepts such as hazard, risk, vulnerability, exposure, they sound very similar. You know, if I were to ask today a DM student about what's the difference between hazard and risk, what's the difference between exposure and vulnerability, they are very nuanced, and you cannot use these words interchangeably. So, and many times you are expected to perform a hazard risk vulnerability analysis, which is called the HRVC. And practically, if you say, I want to work in DRR, one of the first things they'll ask you is, can you do the HRVC analysis, right? So the ability to understand the nuance of the range of concepts, the range of problems, because disasters are not homogeneous. So there are, there are earthquakes, and there are tsunamis, and there are landslides, and then you have something like a drought or a pandemic and they're all very different. So to be able to you need the mind of an analyst, and that will come only it's through reading a lot. To be familiar with the academic deliberations and how the sector has evolved. So one primary skill is not to be afraid to be able to deal with complexity, to really be able to deal with complexity. And it's something that can be developed. It's not something that, I'm a simple person, so I can't, it's not that way. You can develop the skill by engaging the nuance. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much. I think we would like to take up any more questions from anyone else. Feel free to ask. Thank you.
I have a question, actually. I'd like to know what can a person who, even besides having a career in this field, now I actually joined this webinar mostly because I'm interested in gender disparity and not because I'm looking for a career. So I wanted to know that someone who isn't planning to work in this field, what can they do to help with this disparity besides just spreading awareness? Because from the presentation, it does seem that a lot of patriarchal norms, which is so deep rooted in our culture, tends to be one of the biggest factors in causing this big difference. And I mean, we have seen some of the effects of education and spreading awareness, but is there anything else that a person outside of this field could do?
You can, it's a good question, but it's also tough because how do you engage with, I mean, you're more interested in the gender angle rather than manage, I mean,
not the gendered angle, particularly in this context of disaster management.
Yeah. So one of the things that, you could, if you want to work in the sector, if you want to work in, so identify where is it that you want to locate yourself? Are you in, what is it that interests you? Do you want to actually go and do intervention, volunteer? Do you want to go and work with a community? And when you work with a community, it's fairly long-term. It's not 2 days, 3 days, 5 days. Can I do a long-term engagement with communities and look at their current food security status or education status or livelihood status? Can we, maybe get them to access existing governmental schemes and benefits that they're perhaps not aware of? We talk about all these yojanas, this yojana, Pradhan Mantri, that yojana, and all. Some of them are not even aware that all of these are even there. So just to be able to, especially, there's an illiteracy as well. So if you can, state that if you can go and work with the community and get them to know that these are your rights, these are the schemes, you can access these schemes, and it'll help you. Sometimes post disasters, people get cash transfers or they get insurance, but nobody's aware that these schemes are even there. So it's a very small, basic intervention, but that goes a long way. I mean, to change society is very difficult for anyone. So that's separate. But if we have to do a small daily sort of interventions, get people to know that, these are your rights and these are your schemes you can
options access. That these are the options that they have.
Yeah.
Thank you
so the options we have.
Right. Thanks, Rasha, for the question. Lavanya, I would like to read out some questions from the chat box for you.
Yeah.
Sunaina asks a very interesting question. She asks, can I teach martial arts to girls in order to reduce physical and sexual harassment in school? Will that be a good job? Like, that's what Sunaina asks. Lavanya, your take on it.
So I'm all for martial arts and self-defense and things like that. I think it's good for all of us to learn. But my larger deliberation is whether it will reduce sexual harassment. You know, in addition to the martial arts and the self-defense classes, we need to work with boys as well. We cannot exclude men and boys from the conversation on sexual harassment. Currently, what's happening is we work in a silo. We work with the group, we work with the victims, but that doesn't really always help. You have to work with potential perpetrators as well, and it has to be a community conversation. So yes, martial arts is good. It's good. I mean, fitness as well, and from self-defense perspective, yes, if you can, some of us carry pepper spray and things like that sometimes, but there's a larger, deeper rooted issue, right? So a lot of community organizations work with both boys and girls and other genders together. So we address it collectively. I think it's not going to solve the problem.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. But I guess, ma'am, this will be a challenging one. So that's why I thought, can we teach that to the students as well, whether it's a male or a female? In today's scenario, seeing the present scenario, as the women are becoming victims. So if this can be done, ma'am, so I believe will that be this is a challenge for all of us, ma'am, but will that be a better option? That's what I wanted to know.
It's good for anyone. I mean, even I would like to learn martial arts, and it's a good option, no doubt about it. But what are the my sort of not advice, but I would urge you to think about, why are you doing it? Is it, go ahead and do it, and it'll be something that somebody learns. But will it reduce sexual harassment? I doubt. Yeah, because the conversations have to be larger groups.
If I could also add a slightly more grim point to that, as someone who has taken a self-defense class as such, our trainer had told us that, yes, this is important to know, but you should also know that if you fight back too much, you have a higher chance of being killed. Like, it is a very grim point to add, but knowing self-defense does not reduce sexual assault by much. It just probably makes the person feel a little braver.
Right. Okay, thanks. I think that's pretty interesting points. Thank you, everyone. I'll just move to another question, Lavanya. We have a little time, I hope. This is from Shayantika. She asks a question on how to prepare for any interview for learning disaster studies.
So, no, it's a fair point, because to get into the it's still part of formal education and higher education and so on. So one is your general knowledge on the disasters around the world globally, and especially to look at what caused it, to understand the cause and to understand the impacts. And one question you might get asked is, what would you have done differently? Like, how will you reduce the impact? What could you have done? So if you look at the Chile earthquake and the Haiti earthquake, one had a higher magnitude, but the impact was much lower because the people had a higher HDI. So you should be able to, as I said, understand nuance. So general knowledge of disasters around the world, and questions of climate change, something that we all talk about, and how it's linked to climate change, questions of sustainability, and actually very good being updated on what's happening in the field. So primarily that. So you need to look at, say, the last 5 or 6 years. Suppose you're going for an interview tomorrow. So previous 5 or 6 or 10 years of key disaster events, their causes, their impacts, their consequences, and what would you do differently? Who were the people most affected? Because in some places, men were more affected than women. Some places it was young girls, young boys. So why? Why is it that that group was most affected? So you should be able to identify who was most vulnerable and why that happened. Yeah.
Great, great. Thank you so much. And there was one question which I just saw right now from Aditya. Aditya, if you're still there. Aditya asks Lavanya that how you explained the gender dimension, how disasters affect gender differently. Aditya wants to know what are the other dimensions in the course?
So gender is one thematic area of inquiry, one category of inquiry. So when you do a course in disaster management, you will work across other thematic areas of inquiry, other dimensions. So for instance, caste and gender is a cross-cutting theme, right? So you can look at gender and caste. You can look at gender and health. You can look at gender and poverty. You can look at gender and ethnicity, gender and religious mind. So we look at other areas of that causes people's vulnerability. You know, you could look at in a particular locality, who are the most vulnerable historically in that region and why. And gender is just one area of inquiry, so it can intersect with other areas of inquiry. So be religion, it could be ethnicity, it could be language, membership to a certain linguistic community, and or it could be migrant status. So we in some communities we are very xenophobic. We don't like migrants at all. Like, so it could be nothing other than the fact that that person is a migrant. And then if it's a woman migrant, then you have one more burden on your identity. So, and if it's a person with disability, who's a migrant, who's a woman, who is a lower caste, different burdens on the identity, right? So it becomes amplified. So other dimensions are your caste, class, ethnicity, religion, any kind of historical disadvantage because of your social location.
Right. I believe, like, there are no more questions from the audience and the participants. What we would
I have
like
one last
to.
question actually.
Oh
I'm so
yes,
sorry.
Rasha.
Just
a quick
Please go
one.
ahead.
Yeah.
Please go
So-
ahead. You're most welcome.
So I was actually curious about what the difference is between a hazard and a risk, and the risk, no, the vulnerability and exposure, I think.
Exposure.
Yeah.
So a hazard is something that can cause a potential damage. Okay. So you have, let's say, a fire hazard. We'll say that this is a fire hazard. This particular a line, electricity exposed line. So that's a fire hazard. Or something is a hazard. It has the potential to cause damage. Risk is what is the likelihood of it causing damage? What is the consequence of it causing damage? It can be quantified. Risk you can measure, you can quantify it, and you can diagnose the risk and treat the risk. So what is the risk posed by this hazard? What is the likelihood that there will be a fire? What is the consequence of that fire? The possibility of loss or injury as they become exposed to the hazard. So now the question is, what is exposure? Exposure is the condition of being unprotected from the hazard. I am exposed to the hazard. I'm exposed to the cold. So I open the window when I'm exposed to the cold. I'm unprotected from the cold because I'm not wearing something. warm. Yeah, so that's exposure. And vulnerability is the characteristics and circumstances of a person or a group that influence their capacity to deal with the problem. So tomorrow I'm vulnerable to a landslide. Landslide is the hazard. What is the risk? What is the risk of landslide turning into a disaster, of the likelihood of the landslide happening, the consequence of it happening? And I'm vulnerable because I'm a poor migrant worker who can't find housing in a big city like Bombay. So I go live in the outskirts near the landslide. So I'm vulnerable to that and I'm exposed to that because I'm unprotected from it. So that's the right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that was a truly very intriguing, interesting, and what I can realize from the discussion today is that this is possibly the start of our intervention. Our intervention, I guess, starts first from our thinking capacity, which, thanks to Lavanya, we have been able to trigger in some way to understand and look at situations around us from the lens of gender, from the lens of risk, hazard. I think that is also an aspect of an ability to judge and critically understand situations around us better.
So I have a question to Lavanya, ma'am, if you can give me one.
Yes, Sunana, quickly. Thank you. Thank you.
Sir, a small question.
Yes.
Suppose, sir, like in these days we had incessant rain. So, ma'am, that time if water has means entered into your house, and somehow your laptop charge has been over, and you have to take a class. So, what should we do at that time? We can't charge the laptop during when there is means water inside your house, and that will be hazardous, I guess. So, what's the quick? Is there any what's the quick remedy so that we can do it and we can take the class as well as there is no hazard? Like one case happened.
Safety first.
Safety
like
first.
Suppose
Yeah.
like in phone's charge has also gone away. Laptop charge is not there. So I have to take a class. So how will I do?
Yeah. So if your house is flooded, I would postpone the class because I would, because I don't want to endanger my belongings and my people and whatever's happening in the house, and we can do the class on another day. Or you be prepared if you have to take the class. You be
like for 3-4 days if this happens, like water is not going, but I have to take a class. So what should I do that time? I can't. One day so that we can say ki water is not going from my house, so I'm trying to. But ma'am, if this happens for a week, we'll try our best to at least go. But ma'am, due to the rain, so we can't do so, na. So is there any remedy? What can be done? No.
Not really.
Yeah,
We just have to be better prepared.
Yeah.
It's a long-term, it's a structural question. It's a question, how do we prevent repetition of such a situation, which is what, which is what preparedness teaches us. So if you've suffered a loss because of this incident, how do you ensure that it doesn't repeat and therefore you don't lose valuables? You don't. So it's a learning. What will you do differently, and what can the state do differently, or what can policy do differently to protect you? That's what we want to look at.
Well, that's dangerous also, no, ma'am. In the paper also these days it had come. One case had happened in this way. They were charging the laptop or some phone, and they got electrocuted due to that.
Right.
The entire family. This is a little dangerous as well.
Exactly. I think
it is a hazard. It is a hazard.
It is.
And so
thanks,
nothing
Sunan. I
can be
think it's actually, I mean, as Lavanya puts it, when it's a more long-term situation, which is here the problem is sustaining. The question is always about, as Lavanya put it, that how do we sustain ourselves out, away from the disaster, protect ourselves from the disaster. Here the problem is persisting longer. So definitely there has to be a more structural, institutional intervention, as Lavanya puts it, and that needs to be
Yes, sir.
done. Thank you
Thank
so
you, sir.
much,
Thank you,
Sunaina.
ma'am. Thank you,
Thanks
sir.
a lot. And Lavanya, we can't thank you enough
No, it's
for.
my pleasure. Thank you for having me. And it was
No,
lovely
I
to
think,
listen.
yeah, it's lovely, and it's also very interesting for us to realize the emerging opportunities, with our knowledge and subject that we can apply. I know there are people out here who are in their, if I'm not mistaken, we have someone like Sharanya who is actually in class 12th right now, and she has
wow.
joined the session, and so she's also ardently listening to the presentation. We have people from undergraduate studies, there are students from social work, there are aspiring students, even from masters looking ahead for opportunities beyond. And the time that we are right now in, just before the start of the session, we were discussing that the economy is trying to recover. We are trying to look up. We are trying to reinstate our confidence back. Disaster management can be a very strong framework to be able to sustain that confidence. That is exactly one of the points in which many of us, with our take-backs from this session, might look forward to chart our career choices and decisions oriented around disaster studies, disaster management. And I think the ability, as Lavanya said, like the lens of understanding what a hazard is, what a risk is, the gender dimension also, which quite rightly Rasha had asked and Lavanya had elaborated, as well as Sunaina's real-time case study that she shared. They all sum up the big scope of the program across the society as well as the industry. On that note, I would like to thank each one of you for coming to the session, turning in, participating. I know it's midweek, Wednesday, but all of you had taken out your time to be with us. Thanks a lot for that. And thank you, Lavanya, once more for sharing your insights with us.
Thank you.
We will be definitely in touch with all of you. Let this session be the starter to more sustained intervention, if I may say, in the days ahead, in the fields of social science and the social sector. From all of us back at Catalyst, thank you so much. I would like to also thank, we don't have our team members, but Meghna, Sucharita, who are all there, knitting together this event, from behind the scenes, and from everyone at Catalyst, and to each of you, the participants, my best wishes. Stay in touch, associate your learning more to things around you, and as Lavanya pointed out, make your decisions more inclusive as well as sustained in its impact.
Right. Thank you so much for having me, Saurabheshwar, and to Catalyst and all the participants. Also want to thank my student Deepinder, who's been here, and Arya, my friend, and it's wonderful to speak to all of you for having me here. Thank you, Rasha and Sunaina, for your questions and Arvind.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot, Lavanya. On that note, we will say au revoir till we meet, and we'll definitely, be back with some more sessions. And if possible, we'd love to, host more interesting and important sessions with Lavanya in the days ahead. Thank you so much.
Absolutely, in whatever way we can collaborate. Yes.
Sure.
Thank you. All the best.